found it really, really, really intimidating, and it wasn't really what I did it for. And failing isn't a problem. Failing is actually a huge learning thing. I started to mess about again with the walls. And one of the things I was drawn to was the texture and colour. The colours were absolutely phenomenal. Being creative isn't a one-trick pony. You don't just do painting. You don't just do 3D. You can be creative in cooking, in what you wear, in how you decorate your house.
Hi, I'm Claire, founder of Open Stage Arts drama and singing classes for adults. Lots of the adults who come to our classes and online events are looking for a creativity that has been put on the back burner during their sensible grown-up years. I have found this to be true among other creatives too, so I've decided to find out more about the painters, photographers, writers, printmakers, actors, crafters, teachers, musicians and more that have found or refound their creativity later in life. For this episode, I'm speaking with Lesley Wildman, who creates beautiful artworks using yarns stretched over canvas. Lesley loved her art foundation year, but was disappointed not to get into art college. It wasn't until she decided to train to be a teacher that pursuing her artistic ambitions became a possibility once again. Hi Lesley.
Hello Claire, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. You have a number of artistic strings to your bow, but what is it that you are most involved with right now?
A couple of things really. The art side of it in respects to painting is the painting with threads, so cottons, silks, any colours that attract me that I think I'd like to use, and a little bit of writing, which I didn't see coming on the horizon, so that's an interesting thing. A lot of stuff that I didn't expect to be happening at the moment, which is quite nice.
Brilliant. Start by telling me about your childhood artistic experiences.
I'm one of twins. I've got a twin brother, and when my mother had her, she was only expecting one, so she was completely thrown by the whole experience. And she'd had arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, which comes back really badly after a pregnancy. The state paid for us to go into a nursery, which was unusual. We were from a working class family. It really stuck in my memory, where blue paint was applied over this paper and you were allowed to run your fingers through it. And it just produced this amazing texture and lines and colour densities, and it absolutely mesmerised me, and I've never forgotten it. And I think that's pretty much where I started to feel some kind of creativity, maybe, even if it was unconscious. It was certainly something that kind of medium attracted me to, particularly with the colour. I failed my 11 plus. My mother at that point decided that I was not bright, so in a derogatory way said to me, well, the only thing you can do is art. And so I went to Bedford Art Foundation course. And although it wasn't meant to be a nice thing to say to me, it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me because it was a fantastic course. It was just a freeing up of everything I'd started with that little painting when I was tiny.
Yeah. What was the experience like at your foundation?
Obviously, I was then with other people who were like-minded, which made a difference. It was a time when people didn't have specific categories of things they had to do. It wasn't categorized in that way at all. There was a 3D studio downstairs, and upstairs was the drawing and your little rooms that you had to yourself. And we were literally allowed to do what we wanted. The tutors were amazing. They'd set up the most amazing drawing projects that really blew our minds. We'd walk in one morning and they'd set up all the drawing boards were suspended in midair, thousands of them. I don't know how long it had taken it to do it. And we had to draw them. And that was the drawing challenge, because not only was it perspective, but there was nothing spatially that we could relate to each other. So you had to use the depth of pressure of the pencil or whatever you were using to be able to produce depth. And it was at that point that I started to engage in the idea that your eye can be led to believe a horizon or a distance just by the colour or the pressure of the medium you were using. It was absolutely amazing. It was an opening up. I hadn't been outside of my own tiny village at that point. So to go on the bus to Bedford was like, whoa, I'm in the big time. Yeah, but at the end of that, then you'd apply to go to art school. And I'd met my future husband there as well. So that put another interesting spin on the whole thing. And he got into Leicester and I didn't get in at all. He got in with 6 pieces of work. I had 2 folders full of work and didn't get in anywhere. So I then reluctantly left and got a job.
So what work were you doing?
I I got a job in a hydraulic hose factory as their designer for their literature and their stands. It was the only job I could get,
Oh,
and it was the worst job I ever had. There's nothing creative particularly in it. I mean, we did our best with some of the stands that we had to put up, but I was way out of my depth, didn't like it at all. And when my husband came back from college, we stayed in Bedford and I worked in what was then a pronto print. I don't even think they do that anymore.
I remember.
I was their designer for a while. That was another interesting thing. But that was quite a discipline actually, because I had to become more graphic in what I was doing and I was less able to be and have that kind of freedom. So there was a learned thing there. It did actually constrain me for a while, but in a way that was really useful.
Yeah.
Andrew and I got married and I had 3 children. So it wasn't until quite late on that I was then able to go back into art education. I carried on doing all sorts of things. And my husband was at the time working for Marvel Comics. So we did have an artistic base between us, which was quite good. But then as the children got older, I really hankered to go back to learning art, learning anything I could.
Yeah. So you did manage to go back to art education, first through teacher training, I believe, but then to study 3D design at Middlesex University. How did that all come about, and how did you manage to juggle uni and life as a grown up with all the responsibilities that brings?
I was really lucky. Andrew at that point was working at home, so he had his studio in the garden. I'd got a lovely lady I knew who childminded my youngest daughter. And because he was working at home, he just used to get the children from school. And there was a big move at that time to get teachers into primary schools. And Bedford again had a teacher training course at De Montfort. And you could do an access to teacher training. So when I'd left school, I came away. I didn't do O levels, so I only had CSEs, which didn't count for anything. But I had to have 2 more A levels and 4 more O levels to get onto the teacher training. So I did a night school teacher training course and managed to get them all in 1 year, which was pretty hard going, I have to say. But while I was there, at the time you could do art as a major in teaching, which unfortunately and tragically you can't do now. So I did art and English literature. Again, something I wouldn't necessarily have looked into, but absolutely loved. And while you had to be assessed with your art as you were going along, and the first year I was assessed by an external examiner, and he just took me to one side and said, if you stay here, your level of art will drop. And fortunately, there was a lady there whose husband was a technician at Middlesex, all serendipitously. There was nothing planned at all. And she said to me, I think you should apply. And I did apply, thinking, well, give it another go. And I got in, and I was just absolutely bowled over by it. But then I had to tell the art tutor at Bedford that I was leaving, and he was not impressed. But there was nothing was going to stop me. I was going to go without a doubt. So I used to drive to London or Potters Bar every day. And at the time, as a mature student, I could be funded to go. So I had no money worries in that respect. So I was really, really lucky. And it was a really nice course. Again, it was quite free. We did lots of disciplines. So you could try out everything in the first and second year. It was absolutely brilliant. And then when you got to the third year, you could choose, and I chose glass. And I chose it because there weren't many people doing it. I loved it because it was sparkly. I mean, there was nothing planned about this. It was so what attracted me more than anything. It wasn't really what's the practicalities of doing this at all.
Yeah.
It was a challenge to be able to actually use a furnace. And really, it's a great medium to be able to use, but to be technically good at glass blowing, you'd need years of practice. So although you had a inroad into understanding how it was physically difficult to do, to actually get anything blown, you would have to employ somebody, and that's when the costs start to come in. So I used hot glass rods. Well, I actually did do them from the furnace, and they were rolled on a metal table and then cut and joined into circles because I really wanted to make a bigger piece. But to make a big piece as a blown glass is almost physically impossible, especially if you've only been doing it for a year. So I joined those rings together with metal, and the metal I chose was silver and copper could be patinated into different colours. So that made a grid that held the glass rods together, and the whole thing moved, which is not necessarily what you'd expect with glass.
Yeah.
It was the idea and the ability to be able to play with that medium that brought that about, which was, again, not planned. It just happened because of being allowed to mess around. That sounds like how can you quantify that in learning today? Oh, here's a module in messing about. It just wouldn't work, but it's absolutely vital.
Yeah.
Getting through to the end was great. Because last year everything was going really well, and then unfortunately Andrew's job caved in. Marvel Comics in the US at that point filed for Chapter 11, which was bankruptcy, and in true American form, it was everything shut down overnight. So we lost all of our income, and we had at that point moved into a bigger house, which turned out to be the money pit. And he spiraled into depression, which was difficult to handle. But he was absolutely determined that I wasn't going to give up the final year. So to be able to continue, I had to get a job, which I managed to work as an admin in the art history department at Middlesex. And I got a job in the evening. So I'd come home in the evening for about 6 o'clock and then get the kids tea, go to the RSPB, which was near where I lived, and do their data entry till 10 at night and then start again the next day. It was grueling, but it meant I had to do it. I was compromising a lot of people to do this. We were compromising our financial situation, but I still managed to get a first. So I was really proud of it, and I knew then I'd got it in me to be able to do it. And I think maybe with the pressure, as hard as it was, it meant I had to be focused, and that was a good but bad kind of situation and a life learning situation for not just for me but for my husband and us as a relationship. And he did eventually manage to then get a job in Oxford.
I asked Lesley about applying to join the Royal College and her unusual interview experiences.
Somebody put a small piece of what they call a maquette, which is a smaller version of something you're about to make, and it went into a package that went to Stourbridge Glass Museum. I'd already applied to the Royal College once and I didn't get it. And everybody applied. If you got a first, that's what you did. You applied to the Royal College. And I went along for the interview and spoke to Professor Martin Smith. Very nice, thank you very much. Halfway through the interview, the fire alarm goes off. So I had to finish the interview outside the Royal Albert Hall. So the intimidation was unbelievable. And I didn't get in. So I thought, great, no problem. Meanwhile, this package had gone and the piece I put in actually won a prize. And I actually spoke to the lady that did the judging, and she said to me, you must apply to the Royal College again. She was about to become a tutor there and encouraged me to apply again, which I did. At that point, I was having to make sure that we were still earning a living. So I'd opened up a small gallery. We'd moved to a smaller place in a very small town, and that was going really well. I'd been asked to do some teaching at Bedford Foundation one of the art tutors there, 3D artist, who was a sculptor called Andrew Jelly, had fallen off his bike and broken his hip. And they'd got into contact with me to go and take on the course, which I did. And I really, really liked it. And then they offered me more hours. And that was the inroad to the teaching in the subject I really liked. The gallery was going really well. And then they said, apply to Royal College again. And I thought, well, I don't really know whether I need to, whether it's something I should do. I've got to think of the financial side of things. I've got to think of the future for the children. My husband just said, go for it, see what happens. I'd unfortunately had my wisdom teeth out 2 days before, and I couldn't change the date of the interview. So I landed up going with bruising down my neck. I couldn't open my jaw very well. And I sat
No
near the
way.
radiator, and I don't remember my feet touching the floor. I've got no idea what I said. And halfway through the second interview, the fire alarm goes off again. Honestly, and Professor Smith looked at me and he said, this happened last time, didn't it? I suddenly thought, you remember me. It meant I was there. It meant I'd actually been seen and noticed. So again, we had to finish the interview outside the Royal College. It was absolutely chucking it down. And again, I'm like happy as Larry. I'm on these drugs. Thank you very much. And I did get in, and it was great. It was an absolutely amazing, but intimidating. It meant decisions had to be made. It meant I'd got to really consider why I was doing this. And in my true fashion, I didn't take any of that into consideration. And my husband said, you've got to do it. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. You've got to do
Wow.
it. And again, I was so lucky because it was paid, the tuition fees were paid for me. And at the time, they were £15,000 a year. I have no idea how people could afford it unless they get help. There were a lot of foreign students there that paid most of it, and it was a time when they were trying to force art into industry. It had to kind of represent itself as something that could bring in an income. It wasn't just the odd artist becoming famous. It was the purpose of art was to further industry, to further produce something where quantifiable and with money value. So it was a very strange closing down, if you like, or trying pigeonholing all of that freedom that I'd felt before into certain categories. The glass studio there was very small, again, just the one furnace, so it's quite difficult. So I took on a separate course at Westminster to do scientific glass blowing, which taught me a lot, but I
Yeah.
did pay for that. And it then brought me into using glass as very thin rods, similar with a torch, very similar to the people you used to see in seaside resorts that made glass animals. And it meant, again, I could
Mm.
use that particular medium in small pieces to make larger. And that's kind of what I started with. I started with, well, okay, how far can I push this? And I managed to produce a torus, so a circle, almost like a tire, and it was 22 inches wide. And it stood on its own. So I had to have a cradle made for it from aluminium, but it stood up. And that at the end of the Royal College I was asked to send that to Sotheby's in New York, which was fantastic, but again, incredibly intimidating. The end of year show at the Royal College was gallery festival. I mean, everybody came. Saatchi, Sotheby's, Christie's, all the kind of top-notch galleries came along. But there was a strange kind of thing because it moved then from something I was enjoying to something again that became particularly commercial to some degree. So they would come around and assess the value of the resale of the pieces you were doing. And I get, art is about if you want to make a living out of it, that's what it becomes. But for me, the moment somebody said to me, can you make it in blue without understanding the complexities of bringing in a colour to a clear glass, I just thought, how can I do? I would have to set up an entire workshop to be able to do this. And I couldn't afford to do that. But that particular piece came back from New York because it was 9/11, so nothing was opened. It all came back. They'd used the Queen's shippers, so everything came back absolutely pristine. It was in a purpose-built wooden box, this thing. I'd been asked from the show to put a piece in the V&A Contemporary, which they did every year, that was in the basement because it wouldn't be at the front because we were contemporary. This piece that I'd produced was going to be on a turntable and lit so that it would catch the light as it moved. So it's going to be this lady's particular showpiece. She was an online gallery owner. And when it came out from the storage, it was squashed to smithereens. It was absolutely powder. It was just in a million pieces. So it didn't get shown, and I didn't get any of the insurance money because I hadn't paid for the insurance. I'd had a piece in the Crafts Council, which was in Neal's Yard at that time. It was a piece I'd produced over months, and they'd changed a light bulb over it and dropped the light bulb and broke the piece. I'd had a gallery in Paris ask me to produce something similar to what I'd done when I was at Middlesex, one of the bags. And it was a commission, and it was by one of the perfumiers who'd asked to have it in black, so I had to work out how to use a colour in a clear glass, and they wanted it threaded with enamelled red copper. All of that at the time I had to import because it wasn't available here, freely available now, of course. Went off to Paris, and I never saw it or any money again. And it got to the point where I thought, okay, I get that I'm in these amazing galleries. I'm seen by these people. This is the whole point of what you wanted to do. But it absolutely left me broke. There was no comeback. The whole gallery system to me was, at that level, was something I'd never encountered before. There was a kind of, not a greed, but a kind of need for them to prove their worth at cost to me or cost to my work. I found it really, really, really intimidating, and it wasn't really what I did it for, to be honest. You know, we'd all like to make a living out of it, but for me, it was the creative side of it. That was that touched my soul, if you like. So it was a lot of thinking about, well, how do I carry on with this? You know, I can't put my family through even more, and I just had to get a job. And by that point, Andrew had moved to a new
naturally,
job
you're
in
feeling
Oxford. He was
deflated
working for
and
a games
fed up.
company,
And I know that you took a
and I
bit of
had
a
to get a
step
job.
back
I
from the
just had
art
to do
world at
something.
that point. So tell me more about that time.
Mm. Well, we'd moved to the only house we could afford in Chipping Norton because at the time it's a lot more expensive to live here than it was in Bedfordshire. We went into a very dilapidated 60s built chalet bungalow. But opposite that was a veterinary hospital that was asking for a Saturday girl. And I really loved animals. We'd always had cats and dogs. I had a horse when I was younger. My mother was a kennel maid. There was all that kind of side of me as well. And what seemed to be happening was that anything I did was from a hobby or something I really liked doing. And I thought, well, I'll go and do a Saturday job. It'd be fine. By this time, the children were older and at school. And I went, and the interview consisted of one of the vets saying, do you like animals? And I said, yes. And he said, you've got the job. Weirdly enough, I walked in thinking, it'd been there 25 years, probably even more. So it was very, very set in its way of working. And I can't, being creative, thought, well, let's improve it. Let's change this. I could see how that could happen. Better conditions for the nurses, better run meetings. So my creativity went from being on pen and paper or whatever medium I was using, and was looking at almost as if that veterinary practice was a 3D model I could mould into whatever I thought would work best, which was fine, but it wasn't necessarily what they wanted. I felt a bit like I was beating my head against a brick wall. And they did take on a lot of stuff, but it wasn't. It got as far as it could to that extent. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about planning, and I learned a lot about myself and my capability And also that being creative isn't a one-trick pony. You don't just do painting. You don't just do 3D. You can be creative in cooking, in what you wear, in how you decorate your house, in people you meet, in all of those kind of things. And
Yeah.
that was great and the biggest freedom of all for me, because it meant I could be creative and mess about, those words again, with anything. After a while, I then went into partnership in a wool shop with the lovely Claire Jarvis, called the Fiberworks, and I was there for 7 years. And I was surrounded by the most beautiful colours, textures, wools, fabrics, everything. And apart from running the shop, I started to mess about again with the wools. And one of the things I was drawn to was the texture and colour. The colours were absolutely phenomenal. And I'd got some canvases, and I thought, well, I'll have a go and see what happens. Some of the balls of wool I couldn't use because they were so beautiful as they were, which really my husband really appreciated, because that collection grew quite quickly. I then started to use them by wrapping them around I had a very long, thin canvas that I'd never used because it was a really odd shape. I thought I'd just wrap it around and see what happened. And it was amazing what happened. The colour produced this depth. Because we're so used to seeing the horizon, you form that connection and you can see it in something that isn't there. And that was absolutely fascinating to me. I thought, wow, that's really good. And I wondered if I could actually produce that so it looked more like a landscape. And I tried it more and more and more. And that's how the thread painting came about. And I was in a lucky position to be able to use those yarns. And I'd also been able to take part in a class of yarn dyeing, so I can actually dye those yarns the colours I needed. Again, it was one of those situations. Okay, well, let's see how big I can go, and I did produce some that were about 4 foot long. And also, I could use sparkly stuff. I could bring in those thin threads that you'd normally see on wedding dresses, just to set it off to look like water, so that as you moved by it, it's almost as though the sea was rolling. It was almost as though the rain was falling or the mist was coming down.
Which goes back
This
to
flat piece of
your
wrapped wool and
exercise
cottons
in
and
the
silks
foundation
produces
that you
somebody
mentioned at the
standing on the
beginning
edge of the
about
sea,
the seeing the
or
depth.
standing in a wood or on a
When you are
hillside.
wrapping your threads, are you inspired by the threads? Are you trying to replicate something that you see, or is it a mix of both?
Yeah. It's definitely a mix of both. I've had particular yarn recently that just looked like a poppy field before you did anything. But I've also been on walks around the country and seen it. At one point, I did a landscape of a wheat field looking through a hedge. And I thought, well, I wonder how far I can use the corners of the canvas to produce that peeking through a hole feeling. Because obviously there are constraints to it, and there are things, if you do it too tight to the corner, it will all unravel. So the pushing of it, and that's the whole thing I think I've tried to do with everything I've done. The more you push it, the more you learn your limits and the more you learn what you can and can't do with it. But unless you try it, you don't know. And failing isn't a problem. Failing is actually a huge learning thing. So if I've done some and I've thought, oh, that looks like a muddy pool,
Yeah.
or using too much black flattens it. But the only way I knew that was by trying it. So there are a few canvases that are going nowhere and will be seen by nobody. I think having been to a foundation that allowed you to do so much for yourself, and obviously that worked for some people and it didn't for others. For me, it was gold. They would ask you to push something, so getting to a stopping point is a whole other learning curve. But then what do you do? And in some respects, you do leave it, but you learn from that to do something bigger, do something better, push it whichever way you wanted to, turn it inside out, upside down, change the colour, black and white colour or not. It was amazing. Also, to use different mediums to produce the thing you were trying to say. And that was something that I don't think there is so much of nowadays. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that the more art is pushed into things that can be categorized, so your sections that they do at school for art now, where you have to do so many things and then you pass that module, you have to do that many things, you pass that module, means you very often don't interlink the two. And if you do, it's almost difficult to then categorize it. Doing textiles is the way I do has been difficult getting it in galleries again, because where do I fit? Am I textiles, or am I painting, or am I 3D? So that's been a little bit difficult, but I don't mind that. I don't mind that at all. That's me kind of giving up, not giving up on the galleries, but literally saying, this is what it is. It's your job to decide whether you need to put it in a category. And I was fortunate enough to be shown in a Woodstock gallery, and that is an amazing place because there are no categories, and the more out of the box you are, the better. Darlie and the Bear was absolutely brilliant. It was a good place to be, and a fantastic place to see what other people are doing in the same context, really.
Yeah, I was going to say about Darlie and the Bear because I went there to see yours, but I was very impressed with the very different materials. And there was a doll's house in the Chipping Norton part of it. There's this beautiful, colourful acrylics that this other chap does. I loved it there. All sorts of different stuff. It was brilliant. Where do you get your threads from?
It's been interesting. Obviously I worked in the wool shop anyway, so any threads that came in that I found interesting, I would use and could purchase. But some people would bring in their late grandmother's sewing boxes or wool collections. Or there was one lady who was a wedding dress seamstress, and she'd passed away, and her family said, "Did you want any of this?" And I just thought, oh, what couldn't I had the lot? It was absolutely phenomenal. So they're repurposed. A lot of it is repurposed for things that would have been thrown away, which would have been a tragedy for me, because I didn't know you could get so many different colours of gold, or how shimmery some silvers can be, and how flat some could be, and there are rainbow stuff. It's like a treasure box. And it was and people then knew I was doing this. I've now got this massive stash, and sometimes it's just so lovely to look at it. So there are some yarns or some cottons that change colour as they go through. So even on the cotton reel, you've got a variegation, and it's fascinating. Just, I don't know. That's me, I suppose. My way of looking is through not necessarily what I'm going to do with it in the long run, because that's just the journey I go on with those things, but to notice and to see some medium that has potential. It's just amazing. I absolutely love it.
Brilliant. Sounds fabulous. You mentioned about not being pigeonholed and your unbound creativity, and I know that you've recently embarked on a writing project. How did that come about?
So that's another thing, kind of not thinking or allowing those things to whatever comes along in life to be approached with creativity means that things open up you weren't really expecting. So I was asked by a lady, a friend of ours, whose husband, Ian Seymour Wells, an artist, Australian, who'd emigrated to England, had passed away, and he had had a studio at the top floor of a three-story building. And she hadn't been in there for 5 years. He'd had a stroke and was unable to get up the stairs, which was a tragedy. And she asked me to help clear it for her. And I was just bowled over by the fact that she'd even asked me. But when I walked into the room, it was absolutely chaotic. And I can remember standing there thinking, what have I let myself in for? But it took about a year, 18 months to actually sort through the whole lot. And I managed to repurpose and reframe some of his work. And we had an exhibition at Chipping Norton Theatre, which was pretty much a sellout, which was absolutely fantastic. His wife was so pleased because it's really what he would have liked, but he'd had a rejection from a Sydney Museum of Modern Art. He was supposed to be having a retrospective there, and they cancelled it. and he never showed anything again. So all his work hadn't been seen for over 20 years. And I was at the privileged position of seeing it all. But in amongst all of this, there were private letters from his aunt, and his aunt was a lady called Barbara Toy, who was a travel writer in the 50s and 60s. And she travelled around the world in a Land Rover, an ancient Land Rover, which she called Pollyanna, on her own, totally naively, going across Arabia when she shouldn't be and being shot at, as was the time when somebody passed away. The letters that they'd sent would then return to the person who'd written them. So they were everywhere. They were all over the place. And I started to catalogue those as well. And they started off in I think it was 1928, I think was the first one, talking about how she'd left Australia, she'd got married, she married a Panamanian consul. They separated, but they never told anybody. She never told anybody she was married. She then lived in London during the Blitz. She was part of ENSA, the people that went abroad to entertain the troops. She was an ambulance driver, and she was a producer and writer for theatre and then film. So she was part of Elstree and part of the beginning of the British film industry. And then just out of the blue decided she was going to travel the world. She became disillusioned with the casting couch mentality, even though it hadn't been called that then. The lady who, the wife, had asked me to clean all this up for her, didn't want any of it. And I couldn't throw it away. I just couldn't. There was so much history and so much of her, Barbara Toy, in the writing of these letters, that I managed to ask a friend of a friend who was a writer and had co-written another book as a biography for somebody. So I asked her if she'd help me, and she jumped at the chance. So we spent another year writing. So at the moment it's with the publisher. But that's something I just did not see coming. And being able to be creative in a different way is quite scary. It was interesting. It's blooming hard, I have to say. Writing's hard because it felt like I'd literally got all my artisticness and put it on my sleeve and said, here you go, have a look at that. What do you think? And it was like, I don't know if it's any good, is it? And maybe that's part of being what creative is. There's the bits of you that come out that you weren't expecting, and that's certainly what's happened with the writing. And art therapy does that for sure. And I think in some respects all art is therapy. Whatever you do has a piece of you in it and has something that, if you're looking, is telling you something. And that, I think, is the fascinating part about it on every level.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks ever so much, Lesley. Thank you so much. How can people connect with you?
Well, I've got a website, lesliewildman.com. I'm on Instagram and all the social media. Can't remember any of it, but there you go. There was an article in Ox magazine a couple of months ago, I think, with a few pictures on there. So yeah, I'm out and about.
That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Lesley.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much too.
No problem. Creativity Found is an Open Stage Arts production. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please feel free to subscribe, rate and review. If you would like to help fund future episodes, you can buy us a coffee. That's ko-fi, the online platform that helps creators receive financial support from fans of their work. Visit ko-fi.com/creativityfoundpodcast. If you have found your creativity as an adult and would like to talk to me for future episodes, drop me a line at claire@openstagearts.co.uk. On Instagram or Facebook, follow @creativityfoundpodcast, where you will find photos of our contributors' artworks and be kept abreast of everything we're up to.